I guess we're kicking off SSP, which is very exciting. SSP 2023, welcome. I've corralled Heather into opening this. Heather's been on our advisory board at DataSeer, and so she's going to stand up and talk for a moment about why she got involved and since DataSeer is important. Heather is quite shy and retiring, so make sure your phones are silent.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, everybody. I think you probably thought you were in like how SSP AV tech works or doesn't work 2023, but no, you're in the industry preview session, so you can, if you're not intending to be in that session, you can get up and head out now. As Tim said, I'm Heather Staines. I'm a senior strategy consultant for DeltaThink, where I'm also the director of community engagement for the open access data and analytics tool. Before DeltaThink, I had been doing some work for DataSeer, and that's where I really quickly became sold on the tool, and when I joined DeltaThink, agreed to stay on the advisory board. I think with what we're seeing in terms of trends in the industry, more journals with not only data availability statements, but going further and making sure that data is actually available, and noting where, assigning identifiers, and then with the OSTP memo coming out in August of last year, that also placed a great importance on the data behind the articles as additional artifacts, linking that data to the articles, making sure that it's in an appropriate repository, although lots remain to be defined around that. I got really excited when I first learned about DataSeer because I feel like I was in the AI camp of AI as a solution in search of a problem for many, many years. And when I talked to Tim about DataSeer and when I had the opportunity to kind of see how it worked for myself, I thought, well, this is something that's going to be pretty easy for non-technical folks like myself to understand, and couldn't have been more thrilled at the reception that we had when we started to take it out kind of into the marketplace. So I've watched through my role on the advisory board, DataSeer gain traction, and try to talk about it every chance I get, if the microphone is working. And so when Adrian and Tim asked me to kind of kick off the session, I was happy to do so. So I hope that you will, if you don't already know about DataSeer, you'll learn a few things here today, and that you'll come out as enthusiastic as I am. I'm going to try to stick around. I'm ducking out on the board meeting right now, but anytime you want to find me around the conference, I'm happy to tell you more about how I've been participating in it. So thank you.
Thank you, Heather. So I'm starting off here from a little bit of a higher level picture. I'm Adrian Stanley. I'm now a strategic advisor. I'm in charge of partnerships with DataSeer. This happened about a week ago, but I've also been on Tim's advisory board. So he's got a real good group of people. But I thought I'd ask the question, why is DataSeer for me? Why did I want to sort of work together with Tim, but why is it for you too? And I think people sort of are attracted either by other smart people, other smart products, or other smart companies to work with. And I think we've got 3 of those here. But there's also another reason, and I'm going to sort of touch on that on a couple of my slides here. So for me, there's been a little bit of a sort of journey. I start off, I think things evolve and iterate. So I've got a sort of axis across the top and axis going down. I was the managing director of the publisher team at Digital Science. So one of the early products we worked with way back then was Figshare. We did some great work with PLoS and other open science advocates. The sort of Go Fair initiative of making things findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable really resonated back then. That was in 2014. seen a number of industry sort of initiatives, and as Heather mentioned, the OSTP Nelson memo. As part of SSP, I was actually chairing a funder task force for 3 years, bringing funders and publishers together. I'm also now chair of a fully open access publishers group and part of OASPA. So on the sort of open science side, there's been an evolution. On a personal side, I also worked for 2.5 years with a pure open access publisher called JMIR, and that's where Tim and myself actually met. Tim was helping out there too. So you form friendships and connections, and I hope many of you have probably read Tim's Scholarly Kitchen posts and seen how he sort of articulates within the community the important things that we're facing. So it was sort of natural to sort of help Tim first as an advisor, and then bringing together other people and other partners. I put this slide in. This was the recent STM conference. There was a number of funder speakers, and this actually highlighted. This was from Taunton Payne from the NIH, showing the evolution of their research data policies. And I think it's also important not just to look at the sort of timeline where we've got to now, but where are we going to be in the next 5 years around open data, compliance checks. But in very practical terms, and Tim's going to tell you a little bit more about the products and how they work, but I was really drawn to the Aligning Science Across Parkinson's is a funder group that DataSeer works closely with. And they have a pretty simple, easy to follow workflow. They also have a call to action that publishers come together and work together across stakeholders. This is something I've been trying to do with the SSP Funder Publisher Task Force. But in essence, if you encourage a researcher who gets a grant from you and often mandate to publish an early preprint of the research to make sure it's open and available, you run a report, you check if all the underlying data, the code, the research protocols are made available. DataSeer helps flag that, and the researchers then update and correct their articles so that the final printed version of record, published version of record, is really a hyperlinked article that really helps advance science. This slide is a little bit more just for those who are really interested in how the compliance works. I won't go into all the details, but there's sort of assessment curations, further curations, and then a finished sort of publication report. So these are the sorts of things that funders are working on that I think are really important for publishers to know and find ways to align. It doesn't have to be through DataSeer, but I think publishers and funders working together is super important. And when we can do that, I think Tim has a couple of slides that show nice pictures of cakes. This is the sort of hyperlinked Ferrari article of, you imagine all the data sets and underlying research data connected to the code, the protocols, the preprints. I think your PDFs, if your publishers in the room, could really be enhanced like this and then support the evolution of research. And to my sort of last point about why you come and work for people and places, there's good companies, good products, good people. But I also think it's important, this is the Michael J. Fox Foundation that Tim and DataSeer work closely with. Can you imagine sort of doing similar things? That they've been making some amazing breakthroughs in Parkinson's and finding the different sort of proteins that affect that. But can you imagine that on your discipline, or if it's one of your friends or your colleagues? One of my close family members just got Parkinson's. So, I think sometimes there's a deeper meaning why we do things in publishing. So it's good to be sort of associated with Tim and the team. Yeah. But I'm going to hand him over now to sort of tell you a lot more of the nitty-gritty details. But thank you all for coming here. Oh, we do have lots of DataSeer socks. If you come by booth 219, come get your socks.
Thank you, Adrian. A bit verklempt now. That was really nice. Okay. Right. So what do we do? Here's the cake. This is a piece of scientific research. What I mean by that is the article itself is really just the icing on the cake. And the cake itself is all the outputs, all the stuff that researchers generated during the process of doing the research that supports the icing. So data sets, code objects, protocols, metadata, lab materials. And all of these come together to make a piece of research. And here's a crude cartoon of what the research process looks like. The funders pay for the research, scientists do the research, scientists send the article to a journal, the journal publishes the article, and then scientists in their end of grant report tell the funder about the article that they published. And of course, the cake has gone from the last 3 steps. And it's a problem. It's a problem from just a pure fiscal perspective. Funders spend about $200,000 to $500,000 per piece of research. Salaries, overheads, lab materials, you name it. Most of those outputs that the money is paying for never become public. They sit on a lab computer and then they get lost. And that money is essentially being wasted because it could be used to A, support the results of the science, and B, generate new science. And it's also harmful for science to not have this material available. So we can't verify the articles without data and code. We can't rerun the author's analyses to see how they got to the results that they present in the article. We can't repeat the research itself without the detailed protocol and the list of exactly what lab materials the authors used. And we also can't join outputs together and understand what relates to what without metadata. So the solution here is to ensure that all research outputs become public, but you all probably knew that. Why now? Why has this become much more exciting now? Is that the OSTP policy, as Heather and Adrian mentioned, is really pushing a lot of people, a lot of agencies to think hard about this. So scientific data underlying peer-reviewed publications has to be made freely available and public accessible by default at the time of publication. That at the time of publication is doing a lot of work there because that means that the work has to take place before publication. We have to ensure that all of these outputs are publicly available and ready and lined up so that when the article becomes public, all the other materials do too. And then there's also a mandate to monitor. So these agencies are also required to monitor. And that means everyone else kind of needs to monitor too because agencies are going to ask some pretty difficult questions. And in particular, this sort of, if you're an institution, why should you care? The NIH's new data monitoring and sharing plan points to a big role for institutions because their plan, which is set up by the authors or the researchers working with their institution, the institution is then responsible for setting up the plan, submitting the plan, and ensuring that the outputs are shared at the end of it, on pain of not receiving further money from the NIH. So this means institutions need to be really working out what their researchers are doing, what they're specifying as the outputs they're going to generate in their data management sharing plan, and then tracking those down, which is really hard. And so this is a huge hair-on-fire problem for institutions because they stand to lose a lot of money if the NIH pulls funding away. So what do? DataSeer answers this need for baseline assessments. You can't really make progress on open science unless you really know where you are right now, unless you know what effect changing your policies has had. So we, Marcel will speak to this in a moment, but one really good example of this is the Open Science Indicators project we've been working on with PLoS. And this has led to data sets like this, where we have for the PLoS corpus that's been published since 2019, we've analyzed the proportion of articles that share data, the proportion of articles that share data on a repository, that's the left-hand graph, and the right-hand graph is authors sharing data anywhere. So you can see that's a higher proportion, but this is actionable information. It lets PLoS decide how to go forward. And without this, it's very hard to decide what to do. And then the other product we have here is compliance checks. And this is really speaks to what the work we do for Aligning Science Across Parkinson's, speaks to the NIH mandate, where we work out exactly what outputs are associated with an article and help the authors share those in the correct place. And then we can demonstrate compliance. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is what we've been doing for Aligning Science Across Parkinson's. This is a really effective process. So, on these graphs, you just look at A here. The y-axis is the percentage of data sets shared. The first version of the manuscript, that is the preprint that's initially posted. We look at that. We send the report to the authors saying this is what you need to do. Very few data sets are being shared at that stage. But by the time we got to the second version, once we've listed to the authors the actions they need to take, then compliance is much, much, much higher. And also, we simultaneously improve the citations of previously shared data sets that the authors have reused. So we're improving the metadata. But the overall philosophy here is that there's a great sort of miasma of confusion over open science. There's a mental burden that you put on a PI when you say, or an author, when you say you have to share your data. Journal policy, institutional policy, funder policy, you have to share your data. And then the PI has to go and work out, okay, so which policies apply to my manuscript? Which data sets do they mean? What do they want me to do? And this cognitive burden is, as studies by the Springer Nature's Figshare's survey on open data has shown, that this is a huge problem for researchers. And what we need to do is leap over that. We need to get away from the very broad sort of statements of what authors need to do and get right down to specifics. For this article right now, you need to share that data set in that repository. That data set goes there. And that's no longer a PI level problem. That can be handed to a junior researcher to do. And that makes it so, so much easier for the authors to do the work of doing open science. Plus, because it's clear what needs to be done for this manuscript, it's much easier for the stakeholder to work out what the author should be doing. And they have vastly improved ability to look for compliance. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and we're going to move to talking to some of our clients who like DataSeer enough to actually want to stand with us here. So I was going to ask Marcel to come up and tell us a bit about what they've been doing with DataSeer. So.
Yeah, I think so.
Brilliant. Okay, so could you perhaps introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. So my name's Marcel LaFlamme, and I'm part of the open research team at PLoS.
Okay, fantastic. So before you started working with DataSeer, what problem did you need to solve?
Yeah. So I guess it's important to say that at PLoS, right, PLoS is a fully kind of a native OA publisher sort of since we were founded, but increasingly kind of increasing the way that researchers share kind of the layers of the cake that you showed, right? So these other research outputs like data and code kind of across the full research cycle, that's increasingly a priority for PLoS. And for us, that's a KPI kind of on the order of revenue targets or publishing volume, things like that. The problem is that we didn't have a good way to measure how well we were doing that, right? So if we have a goal to sort of increase deposits in repositories or preprint posting, we were sort of reliant on our kind of internal systems and often on kind of author-supplied metadata, which was really patchy and incomplete, to be able to track, have the new policies or technology integrations that we've put into place actually done the thing that they said that we were going to do.
Brilliant. So could you outline the work that we've been doing together?
You bet. So we started with kind of a smaller project, a pilot on one particular journal. We'd put a policy in place to require code sharing, and we were interested in finding out, pre and post that policy being put into place, was there a meaningful difference in authors sharing code? So we worked with him and the folks at DataSeer on a pilot to track code sharing for this one title, and really produce this graph that really clearly sort of we see the spike, right? We see that the intervention that we made had the effect that was desired. So then kind of scaling up to the Open Science Indicators project, which Tim talked about. So I mean, at this point, we're sort of crawling the full PLoS corpus, and also comparing that to published outputs by other publishers as well. And yeah, we're sort of sharing that data publicly, which is important to us to sort of have some external impact. But then, as you said, Tim, it's also sort of informing internal decision making as well, being able to measure at what rates authors are engaging in open science practices like data code protocol sharing.
Fantastic. So overall, what impact has this had on your organization?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can think about it kind of internally and externally again. So, I mean, I think on the business intelligence side, there's no question. I think it's allowed us to sort of look at particular communities and to understand open science behaviors. You know, I think we know at PLoS that there's different levels of readiness. There's different things that different research communities want openness to do for them. And so I think with the Open Science Indicators data, being able to sort of look across regions, look across fields, and sort of see how adoption levels vary, and therefore what supports or what products and services PLoS might be able to sort of serve those communities with. The other piece is external impact, and I think it's overperformed our expectations on that so far. So we've seen kind of reanalyses of these data that we've shared publicly kind of in the wild, which is really exciting to see people sort of finding that useful. And so I think for PLoS, as we think about kind of addressing systemic obstacles to open science in the realm of policy, I think we're really finding that the Open Science Indicators data kind of opens the door and kind of gets PLoS to the table in those conversations as well.
Thank you so much. Okay, now we're going to move to the section where it all goes wrong. Let's get rolling. So, Bob, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, certainly. I'm Bob. People have looked at data response. Montgomery, I'm the data editor for American.
It's all going wrong. Yeah, here I am with Sonia Dumanis. So maybe you could introduce. Am I using the wrong player?
So does anybody have any burning questions while Tim and them are sorting this? Anything here?
Yeah, here I am with Sonia Dumanis. So maybe you could introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Sonia Dumanis. I am the Deputy Director for Aligning Science Across Parkinson's. We are an initiative focused on supporting research for Parkinson's disease.
So before you started working with DataSeer, what was the problem you had that you needed to solve?
Sure. So our biggest issue that we were trying to find a solution for was in terms of how do we track, monitor, and enforce our open science policies around compliance. We have very progressive open science policies, and we needed to make sure that there was some workflow end to end, so that way when papers came in, we knew where our grantees were at, and we could help them if they were falling short of the policies.
Awesome. So could you outline what we've done together?
Sure. Initially, when DataSeer and ASAP started working, we created a personalized report that goes specifically to our grantees that reflects our open science policies, and essentially a workflow where a paper comes in, a DataSeer report gets generated, a curator on our back end works with DataSeer to ensure that the report is accurate, and then we work with our grantees to get it published and fully compliant. It's been a great process.
And so could you, like in general, what's the overall impact that this partnership's had for your organization?
Overall, it's created a solution that didn't exist. So when I started as deputy director, this was probably one of the big issues that kept me up at night of, we have these progressive open science policies, but how are we actually going to put our money where our mouth is and be able to help our grantees get to where they need to go?
So thank you, Sonia. Let's get rolling. So, Bob, could you introduce us? Let's get rolling.
No, we'll do Piers' question. No, we should answer it now because unfortunately, the business model. Well, I think around like it needs to happen, the science, and like I said in my presentation, this is for funders. This is a serious problem, and when I don't know if you all saw the Clark Esposito briefer yet come out yesterday, really interesting. But they echoed the line that we're going to have to take money away from research to do open science and open data. My response to that is great, good, because if you're going to publish 100 papers, none of which share any data, or 98, all of which share all their data, that is a really, really good investment to do the latter. But I also see that there's a lot of value, because we've got to talk about societal value and value for what we're doing as an industry together. And then there's the economic value of doing the work. And both of these are definitely there with data sets, because there's a huge amount of interest in using the data, which is kind of up there in terms of importance for future work, to be able to put data sets together and come to big conclusions about things. And if we, as publishers, if we as an industry can ensure that the data sets are alongside these articles and they're carefully curated, then we will be curating and building something of massive value, both to the organizations that have those and the public at large and the world at large. Does that answer your question?
I think, yeah, just
Not at all.
just to,
100%, by the way. 100% behind.
yeah, just to add, I think, there's a sort of a fairly reasonable price to run a report if you're a publisher or if you're a funder, that level thing. But if you think the cost of a retraction of the research integrity,
No, for sure.
yeah. So
This is just a nuts and bolts question, right?
Yeah. You win a pair of socks, by the way.
Could you introduce yourself? Yeah, certainly. I'm Bob Montgomery. I'm the data editor for American Naturalist, which is a position I've had for the past 2 years. And I am a behavioral evolutionary ecologist at Queen's University. Now retired, but I've been there for 42 years prior to retiring. And I'm right now on St. Paul Island in the PLoS in the middle of the Bering Sea. And I'm happy to answer your question. Cool. So before you started working with DataSeer, what problem did you need to solve? That's a great question, and I've been thinking of that for the last couple of hours, because we started using DataSeer pretty much within a month of me starting this job. But the first thing I did to make sure that I could do the work was to go through the entire process of evaluating a paper, looking at the data that they provided and their R or Python code. And that first paper took me 8 hours to process. And so I'd had to really start thinking about how can I cut that down? I don't, life's way too short to spend that much time. And most of that time was trying to figure out what the authors should have included in their data repository. And so that took about 6 of the 8 hours. I had to read the paper, I had to understand what they were doing and so on.
So, okay, then you got in touch with us. Could you outline what DataSeer does for you? What
Yes, certainly. In a few short steps, when a manuscript has been accepted by the American Naturalists, it's on the final stages of acceptance. They send it to me. I forward it right away to DataSeer, and within 24 to maybe 36 hours, DataSeer sends me back a report that lists in a spreadsheet all the kinds of data that they have seen in the paper and all the kinds of analyses and code that the authors use to analyze those data, and a brief summary of whether the DataSeer people saw that the data was in the paper or not, and highlighted some missing things.
That's fantastic. And so, kind of broadly, what impact has this had on the journal?
I wish I could answer that question quantitatively, because I have, in a way, no idea. I know what impact it should have on the journal. And one that's happened already, I guess, is that American Naturalists is clearly now a leader in quality data assurance with published papers. And as you know, Tim, when people have looked at data repositories over the past 10 years, they've been found to be very deficient, either non-existent or data not really in the raw form, or metadata not in a form that makes it useful, or code that doesn't run. And recent analysis showed about 3/4 of all data repositories were essentially useless because of the lack of information.
Thank you. Well, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And we do really enjoy working with you. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tim. That was great.
Okay. So that's the end of us talking. We'd love to take some questions if anyone has anything they want to ask.
I'm curious about any guidelines of researchers who utilize very large data sets, observational data. How do they know what to say?
Right. Well, so, I mean, if you're working at the Large Hadron Collider, which produces phenomenal amounts of data every minute, the data management and sharing there is absolutely world class. And then there's the smaller than that data sets. We don't, generally before you start collecting that scale of data, you have a plan in place for what you're going to do with it and how you're going to sort of winnow it down into being usable stuff and what to put aside, because it's very expensive to collect that volume of data. Then when you get down to sort of genome level data sets, it's fairly well established already. I think where it starts to get iffier is when you're collecting like very complicated microscope images, where a single fairly simple machine, single machine can produce a very large amount of information very quickly. And then we have to decide as a community what to do with it. So for Aligning Science Across Parkinson's, we have done that iteratively. They fund a very wide range of science. And through an iterative process of talking to Aligning Science Across Parkinson's and their authors and going backwards and forwards, we have arrived at a very comprehensive set of guidelines and criteria for all the outputs associated with their work and how each of those should be shared and where it should go and what the files should include. Sometimes we, for example, representative images, if they've taken a bunch of microscope images, for the moment we just say, okay, the ones you've got in the article are fine, or the extra ones you include in the supplemental material. But then in due course, I imagine we will move to, okay, now you need to put the raw microscope images in this place or that place. Does that help?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, it seemed to be, that would be very discipline specific. Yeah, so for example, if you had Marcel, the problem, and I assuming you'd have to go through that same sort of winnowing process, sort of almost with the community to try to come up with some sort of common set of guidelines.
Yeah, the communities by and large, I mean, the AGU has been working on open data a lot. So for that example, I imagine there's very close to an established set of guidelines about what you should do. So we would naturally adopt those and help researchers to work on those. I mean, there's a lot of the time with open science, the perfect is the enemy of the good. So if you can get them to share anything, that's better than letting them say, well, you know, there aren't perfect guidelines for this kind of data, therefore I'm not going to share anything. Just do what you can.
Yeah, one thing I'll add there actually is that I think with the Open Science Indicators Project, one of our sort of principles from the get-go was like, let's meet authors where they are in terms of how they're sharing now, right? And so while we love for everybody to be sort of depositing in fully fair repositories, in a world where people are still sharing data in supplementary information, we want to track that too. And so actually, like, that's been one thing about partnership with DataSeer where I think, yeah, to be able to sort of look at these outputs across different sources, and you know, whether you take a really strict constructionist approach that says it's only the gold standard stuff that we care about, or in PLoS's case, we really wanted the fuller picture of you know, even down to sort of protocols on lab websites and things like that. And so yeah, I mean, it's really been amazing to see Tim and his team be resourceful about how to sort of serve this output in a number of different.
Close to time. I do want to shout out, but either our colleague who's been with Tim want to take questions. Maybe one quick question and then. Is that okay?
Sure. From the PLoS perspective, or maybe Tim can address as well. Perfectly fair repositories. I'm seeing a very large continued growth of GitHub as being the place where people are sharing their data. Are you guys also looking at trends in individual data licenses that people are putting on their data sets, or is it just getting it into a repository for things?
Yeah, we've sort of taken a you know, MVP and then sort of layer on top of that. So thus far, we're not looking at licensing, but yeah, that's a perfect example of the kind of thing we can sort of layer on top, especially if you have the sort of immutable data.
Yeah, it's really challenging because often our BERT models, our natural language recognition picks out we have put the data in code on GitHub, but sometimes we have put the files on GitHub. So what do you mean? What is that? So then you have to dig in and look at the individual licenses that they put on things. It gets pretty hairy. Okay, people are arriving for the next session. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to our speakers, Heather and everyone. So have a good day.